Johnny Carson reveals the golden age Hollywood guests he hated most. For 30 years, Johnny Carson ruled late-night television from behind that iconic Tonight Show desk. The king of late night, America's trusted voice before bedtime. That sly smile, that knowing glance to the camera. Johnny made it look easy, but behind that perfect composure and impeccable comic timing was a man far more complex and far less forgiving than most viewers ever realized. Tonight, we're revealing the guests who pushed Johnny Carson to his breaking point. The stars he privately despised. The interviews that went so wrong, they poisoned relationships forever. You thought you knew Johnny Carson? Think again. The man who welcomed thousands of guests with a warm handshake and friendly banter kept a mental blacklist of celebrities he couldn't stand, and for reasons that might surprise you. From betrayals that cut too deep to heal to behaviors he found unforgivable, these are the famous faces that made television's most unflappable host lose his legendary cool. And what's most shocking, some of these celebrities had no idea they'd earned Johnny's lasting contempt until years later, if they ever discovered it at all. Johnny Carson's Tonight Show was a career-making machine. One appearance could launch a comedian from obscurity to stardom overnight, but that extraordinary power came with extraordinary pressure, not just for the performers, but for Johnny himself. Night after night, for 3 decades, he sat at that desk, responsible for entertaining millions while managing the egos, anxieties, and unpredictable behavior of Hollywood's biggest stars. Is it any wonder he developed strong opinions about his guests? As we explore the celebrities who earned Johnny's rarely seen wrath, we're getting a glimpse behind the curtain of late-night television's golden age and discovering just how thin the line was between Johnny's famous smile and his formidable fury.
I was the first woman in late night, first woman to have her own successful late-night show.
1. Joan Rivers, the protege who committed treason. If there's one guest whose relationship with Johnny Carson defined the word complicated, it was Joan Rivers. Their professional journey together began in the 1960s, when Rivers was still a struggling comedian looking for her big break. Johnny didn't just give her that break, he championed her career with unprecedented support. Rivers first appeared on The Tonight Show in 1965, and the chemistry was immediate. Johnny's laughter at her jokes wasn't just polite, it was genuine, unrestrained, sometimes even to the point of tears. For a comedian, there was no greater validation, and Johnny didn't stop there. He regularly invited her back, giving her invaluable national exposure at a time when female comedians were still fighting for recognition. By the mid-1970s, their professional relationship had evolved into something truly special. Johnny began using Rivers as his permanent guest host, the person who would fill in when he took vacations or needed time off. It was a position of extraordinary trust and visibility. Being Johnny's guest host meant entertaining millions of viewers who tuned in specifically for him. It meant preserving the quality and character of a show that had become an American institution. And Rivers excelled in the role, earning Carson's continued confidence and the audience's growing affection. Behind the scenes, the two developed what appeared to be a genuine friendship. They dined together occasionally, exchanged holiday cards, and spoke of each other with real warmth in interviews. Johnny was known to refer to Joan as "my funny lady" when introducing her, a term of endearment that reflected his clear appreciation for her razor-sharp wit. For nearly 2 decades, their professional partnership seemed unshakable. Rivers had become, in many ways, Carson's comedy daughter, the successor he had personally groomed for greatness. And then came 1986, the year everything fell apart. The breaking point arrived when Rivers accepted an offer to host her own late-night talk show on the fledgling Fox network. The Joan Rivers Show would directly compete with The Tonight Show in the same time slot, a move that Carson viewed not just as a career decision, but as a profound personal betrayal. What made it worse, according to those close to Carson, was that Rivers never called him to discuss the opportunity or explain her decision before signing the deal. Johnny allegedly learned about her new show from Fox executives, not from Rivers herself. For a man who valued loyalty and direct communication, this was unforgivable. Carson's response was swift and absolute, complete excommunication. He never spoke to Rivers again, not once in the remaining 19 years of his life. Her name became essentially forbidden on The Tonight Show, and she was never invited back during his tenure. In the aftermath, Rivers attempted multiple times to reach out and repair the relationship. She sent letters of apology and explanation. She tried to call. According to her autobiography, she even sent flowers on his birthday for several years after the falling out. Carson returned the letters unopened, refused the calls, and ignored the gestures of reconciliation. When asked about Rivers in rare interviews after their split, Carson was unusually blunt for a man typically known for his discretion. "She didn't handle it properly," he told one interviewer. "She didn't tell me. I felt betrayed." To another, he was even more pointed. "I will not ever forgive her." Those who knew Carson well understood the depth of his hurt. To Johnny, it wasn't betrayal, explained one longtime Tonight Show writer. It was treason. He had given her everything: visibility, credibility, his personal endorsement. And in his mind, she had used all of that to try to destroy him. Rivers maintained until her death in 2014 that Carson's reaction was disproportionate to her actions. She insisted she had tried to call him before the news broke, but hadn't been able to reach him. She pointed out that many other Tonight Show alumni had gone on to competing shows without facing such permanent excommunication. What makes this feud particularly poignant is that neither party ever fully recovered from it. Carson maintained his ban even as Rivers' Fox show failed after just one season. And Rivers, despite her subsequent success, spoke frequently about the pain of losing Carson's friendship and mentorship. In her final years, she still became emotional when discussing the rift, telling one interviewer, "It broke my heart. It truly broke my heart." The Carson-Rivers feud represents something more complex than simple professional jealousy or wounded pride. It illuminates the unwritten rules of loyalty in television's golden age, the father-daughter dynamics that often develop between mentors and protégés, and the surprising fragility of relationships in an industry built on appearance and performance. For Johnny Carson, who rarely let the public see beyond his polished on-air persona, his reaction to Rivers' perceived betrayal offered a rare glimpse into what truly mattered to the man behind the desk. Not fame, not ratings, but the trust and loyalty of those he had chosen to elevate.
He said, "Would you like to buy a nice suit for $40? I said, let me see it. He said, "You're wearing it."
2. Bob Hope, When Friendship Fades to Obligation. In the pantheon of 20th century American entertainers, few names shine as brightly as Bob Hope. The legendary comedian, actor, and USO stalwart represented Hollywood royalty, a status that normally would have guaranteed him permanent favorable treatment on The Tonight Show. But according to those who worked closely with Johnny Carson, Hope was one guest whose star power couldn't compensate for what Carson considered increasingly problematic behavior. On the surface, Carson and Hope should have been natural allies. Both were giants of comedy, both understood the pressures of entertaining millions, and both had carefully crafted public personas that hid more complex private lives. Early in Carson's Tonight Show tenure, their relationship appeared genuinely warm. Hope was a frequent and welcome guest, and Carson showed him the respect befitting a comedy legend. But as the years passed, Carson's attitude toward Hope gradually soured. The issues, according to Tonight Show insiders, were numerous, but they centered around what Johnny perceived as Hope's growing ego, decreasing effort, and refusal to engage in genuine conversation. By the 1980s, Hope would only come on to promote something, revealed a former Tonight Show producer who worked closely with Carson. A book, a special, a tour. There always had to be something in it for him, and Johnny hated that transactional quality. He wanted real conversation, not a commercial. More frustrating for Carson was Hope's apparent lack of interest in actually participating in an interview. As one writer put it, Hope would arrive with a stack of index cards filled with pre-written jokes. He didn't want to talk, he wanted to perform his monologue, plug his project, and leave. This approach ran counter to everything Carson valued in a talk show guest: spontaneity, genuine exchange, and the willingness to follow the host's lead. The situation worsened when Hope, advancing in age, began to rely more heavily on cue cards and scripted remarks. Carson, known for his ability to make guests feel comfortable through authentic conversation, found himself increasingly unable to establish any real connection with Hope during his appearances. After one particularly stilted interview in the mid-1980s, Carson allegedly returned to his office and vented to his producer, "Talking to Bob is like talking to a cardboard cutout. Actually, the cardboard cutout might be more responsive." What made the deteriorating relationship particularly awkward was Hope's apparent obliviousness to Carson's growing frustration. Hope continued to expect the royal treatment whenever he appeared, the best spot on the show, extra time if he wanted it, and Carson's unqualified deference. For a host who prided himself on treating his guests with respect, but not reverence, these expectations became increasingly grating. The breaking point, according to several sources, came during a 1986 appearance when Hope ignored Carson's questions and instead launched into a series of prepared jokes about golf, jokes he had used on previous Tonight Show appearances. Carson, visibly annoyed but maintaining his professional demeanor, tried several times to steer the conversation in a different direction. Hope either didn't notice or chose to ignore these attempts. After this episode, Carson allegedly told his booking team to space out Hope's appearances more than they had in the past. "He's not banned," Carson supposedly clarified, "but let's not have him on every time he wants to sell another book of golf jokes." What makes the Carson-Hope relationship particularly interesting is how it evolved from genuine friendship to professional obligation. Unlike his complete break with Joan Rivers, Carson never publicly criticized Hope or refused to have him on the show. Instead, he maintained a respectful on-air persona while privately harboring growing resentment, a dynamic that many in Hollywood found all too familiar. This pattern speaks to Carson's complex character, his ability to compartmentalize his personal feelings for the sake of the show, his deep-seated professional respect for comedy pioneers, and his reluctance to publicly embarrass even those who had disappointed him. In the end, the Carson-Hope relationship became something of a cautionary tale in television circles, a reminder that even legendary status doesn't exempt a guest from the basic expectations of authentic engagement and mutual respect. Bob Hope might have been comedy royalty, but on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson was king, and he expected even royalty to follow the rules of his kingdom.
This is the Casa de Shenandoah. My name is Wayne Newton, and this is my home.
3. Wayne Newton. When Vegas Titans clashed. Las Vegas in the 1970s and 1980s was dominated by two entertainment giants, Johnny Carson, whose weekend performances at the Sahara and later the MGM Grand made him a fixture of the Strip, and Wayne Newton, the Mr. Las Vegas, whose permanent residency shows had become a desert institution. These two performers, each commanding their own substantial kingdoms in the entertainment capital, might have peacefully coexisted had it not been for a series of jokes that escalated into one of the most heated backstage confrontations in Tonight Show history. The trouble began in the late 1970s, when Carson and his writers developed a recurring comedic bit about Newton. The jokes centered on insinuations about Newton's sexuality and effeminate mannerisms, his high voice, his elaborate costumes, his emotional performing style. In the less enlightened era of late 70s comedy, these kinds of jokes were unfortunately common, but they struck particularly deep for Newton, who had been fighting similar insinuations throughout his career. At first, Newton attempted to ignore the barbs. As a veteran entertainer, he understood the unwritten rule that celebrities were expected to tolerate good-natured ribbing from late-night hosts. But as the jokes continued over multiple monologues, Newton's patience wore thin. According to those close to him, he became increasingly convinced that Carson had developed a personal vendetta against him, perhaps motivated by jealousy over Newton's dominant position in Las Vegas entertainment. The situation reached a breaking point in 1981 when Newton was booked as a guest on The Tonight Show. Rather than seeing this as an opportunity to promote his career, Newton viewed it as a chance to confront Carson directly about the jokes that had been troubling him for years. What happened next has become legendary in television circles. According to multiple witnesses, Newton arrived at the NBC studios hours before his scheduled appearance, bypassed the normal guest preparation procedures, and headed directly to Carson's office. Finding the host preparing for that evening's show, Newton closed the door behind him and initiated a confrontation that nearly turned physical. "You've been making jokes about me for years, and I'm sick of it," Newton allegedly began. When Carson attempted to dismiss the concerns as standard comedy fare, Newton's response was unequivocal. "If you keep it up, I'm going to kick your ass." Carson, not known for backing down from confrontation despite his genial on-screen persona, reportedly stood from his desk and responded, "Any time you think you can try, just let me know." The two men stood face to face, tension crackling between them, before Newton ultimately turned and left the office. He proceeded with his scheduled appearance that evening, but viewers noted an unusual coldness in Carson's introduction and questioning. The interview was polite but perfunctory, with none of the warmth or humor that characterized typical Tonight Show conversations. In the aftermath of this confrontation, Carson significantly reduced the Newton jokes in his monologue, not out of respect, those close to him insisted, but because Carson felt Newton had violated an unspoken code by threatening him personally over professional comedy. As one writer put it, Johnny didn't mind a good fight, but he believed in fighting fair, with words and wit, not threats. For his part, Newton didn't shy away from discussing the confrontation in subsequent years. In a 1994 interview, he referred to Carson as very mean-spirited, adding, "He was not the person that most of America thought they knew." These comments only deepened Carson's private animosity toward Newton, according to those in Carson's inner circle. What makes this feud particularly interesting is how it illuminates the power dynamics of entertainment in that era. Carson, with his nightly national platform, possessed the ability to shape public perception through jokes and insinuations. Newton, despite his enormous success in Las Vegas, had no comparable platform to respond. His backstage confrontation, while perhaps ill-advised, represented an attempt to level a playing field that was fundamentally tilted in Carson's favor. The aftermath of their confrontation saw both men continuing their successful careers, but with a wide berth between them. Newton was rarely mentioned on The Tonight Show after 1981, and never again invited as a guest during Carson's tenure. The two maintained a Cold War of sorts in Las Vegas, performing their respective shows without acknowledgement of the other's existence. They shared the Vegas stage, noted one longtime casino executive who knew both men, but never the same respect.
Isn't that the point, to be able to do nothing at all? But we're not guaranteed that later on chunk of time. All we have is here and now.
4. Ellen DeGeneres, the future star he couldn't see. Long before Ellen DeGeneres became a daytime television powerhouse with her own wildly successful talk show, she was a struggling stand-up comedian looking for her big break. That break should have come in the late 1980s, when she made her first appearance on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. Instead, according to those familiar with the situation, her encounter with Carson became an example of how even television's most experienced star maker could sometimes miss the potential right in front of him. DeGeneres' first Tonight Show appearance came after years of working the comedy club circuit. For any comedian, being invited to perform on Carson's stage was the ultimate validation and potentially career-changing. A thumbs up from Johnny, particularly his invitation to come sit on the couch after a stand-up set, was widely considered comedy's most powerful endorsement. Ellen arrived at the NBC studios with high hopes and carefully prepared material. Her comedy style, observational, quirky, with a distinct perspective that came from her unique worldview, had been winning over club audiences across the country. But from the moment she began her set on The Tonight Show, it was clear something wasn't connecting as expected. Carson, normally effusive when he appreciated a comedian, responded to DeGeneres' performance with polite but restrained laughter. He did invite her to the couch after her set, the coveted gesture that signaled approval, but witnesses recall that the brief interview felt awkward and lacking the warmth Johnny typically showed to comics he truly enjoyed. She smiled nervously. He barely looked at her, recalled one production assistant who was present that night. There was just this weird energy, like they were speaking different comedic languages. Behind the scenes, Carson's reaction was reportedly even more dismissive. According to a writer who worked on the show at the time, Johnny commented that DeGeneres' delivery was too flat and her material too subtle for mainstream late-night audiences. He allegedly told his producer not to rush to book her for a return appearance. This assessment seems astonishing in retrospect, given DeGeneres' subsequent rise to become one of the most popular and influential television personalities of her generation. But in that moment, her low-key conversational style, later recognized as refreshingly authentic, struck Carson as insufficient for the broader audience he was accustomed to entertaining. What makes this situation particularly noteworthy is how it differs from Carson's other famous feuds. There was no personal animosity involved, no backstage confrontation, no ongoing pattern of tension. Ellen herself likely had no idea that Carson had formed such a definitive negative opinion about her potential. This wasn't a feud so much as a failure of vision, a rare miss from a man whose judgment about comedic talent was otherwise nearly infallible. The irony, of course, is that DeGeneres would go on to inherit a significant portion of Carson's legacy. Her daytime talk show, with its emphasis on authentic conversation, good-natured humor, and creating comfortable space for celebrity guests, embodied many of the same values that had made The Tonight Show successful under Carson's leadership. The warmth and accessibility that Johnny found too flat would eventually make Ellen one of the most beloved figures in television. For Carson historians, the DeGeneres incident represents a fascinating footnote, a moment when the king of late night, despite all his experience and instinct, failed to recognize the changing tides of comedy. It serves as a reminder that even legends can have blind spots, especially when confronted with talents that deviate from their own understanding of what works. Ellen would eventually return to The Tonight Show multiple times, though not until after Carson's retirement. By then, her career was already on an upward trajectory that would ultimately take her far beyond the stand-up stage to places Johnny might never have imagined. In the end, his inability to appreciate her unique gifts says less about Ellen's talent than it does about the limitations of even the most discerning comic minds when faced with something genuinely new and different.
I got there early and he came in and looked around and sat down and started waiting for me. And I gave myself 15 minutes.
5. Shelley Winters, the hurricane he couldn't control. Shelley Winters was a force of nature both on screen and off. The two-time Oscar winner approached her film roles with the same intensity and unpredictability that characterized her personal interactions, qualities that made her a fascinating performer but a challenging talk show guest. For Johnny Carson, whose carefully crafted show thrived on structure, despite its appearance of casual conversation, Winters represented the ultimate wild card, and one he ultimately decided wasn't worth playing. Winters first appeared on The Tonight Show early in Carson's tenure, when her star power as a dramatic actress was at its height. Initially, Johnny seemed to enjoy her boisterous energy and unfiltered storytelling. Her appearances were lively, unpredictable, and often generated memorable moments, exactly what talk show hosts typically want from their guests. But as the years passed, Winters' behavior became increasingly difficult to manage within the constraints of the show's format. She would frequently interrupt Carson mid-question, talk over other guests, or launch into lengthy, meandering stories that proved nearly impossible to redirect. While some of this made for entertaining television, it created behind-the-scenes headaches for a host who prized his ability to guide conversations with a light but firm hand. The breaking point came during a particularly chaotic appearance in the mid-1970s. Winters had been booked on a night with several other guests, including a young actor promoting his first major film and a conservation expert with animals. According to those present, she arrived at the studio in an exuberant mood that quickly became problematic. From the moment she walked on stage, Winters took control of the interview in a way that clearly frustrated Carson. She interrupted his first question to compliment his suit, then launched into an unrelated story about a costume designer she'd worked with decades earlier. When Johnny tried to steer the conversation back to her current projects, she cut him off again to comment on the previous guest's segment. "You could see Johnny getting tighter and tighter," recalled one camera operator who was working that night. "That muscle in his jaw was twitching, always a danger sign." The situation deteriorated further when Winters began speaking directly to the band, asking Doc Severinsen questions, and effectively sidelining Carson in his own show. After several unsuccessful attempts to regain control of the interview, Johnny finally employed his rarely used but definitive signal to producers, the pencil tap. This subtle gesture, 3 quick taps of his pencil on the desk, was Carson's emergency code indicating he wanted to end a segment immediately. The producer cut to a commercial break several minutes earlier than scheduled. When the show returned, Winters had been removed from the stage, and Carson proceeded with his next guest as if nothing unusual had happened. Backstage, according to multiple sources, Johnny was uncharacteristically blunt with his booking team. "Never again," he allegedly stated. "She thinks it's her show. It's not." True to his word, Shelley Winters was not invited back to The Tonight Show during the remainder of Carson's tenure, a striking decision given her continued prominence in film and television throughout the 1970s and 1980s. When asked about her absence in a rare press interview, Carson was diplomatic but firm. Some guests and some hosts just have different approaches to conversation. What makes the Carson Winters situation particularly interesting is how it highlights the hidden power dynamics of talk shows. While they appear to be casual conversations, these shows are actually highly structured environments with unwritten but strict rules about who controls the flow of discussion. Guests who understand and respect these boundaries tend to become Carson favorites, invited back repeatedly. Those who challenge the host's authority, even in the name of entertainment, risk removal from the roster. For Winters, the Tonight Show ban likely came as a surprise. By all accounts, she believed her appearances were successful and her rapport with Johnny was positive. She thought it was playful, explained one of her longtime friends. He thought it was war. This fundamental misalignment of expectations characterized many of Carson's more difficult guest relationships. As the unquestioned king of late night, Johnny expected a certain deference to his position, not subservience, but acknowledgement that on his show he set the pace and direction of conversations. Stars accustomed to controlling their environments in other contexts sometimes struggled with this dynamic, leading to the tensions that characterized Carson's relationship with Winters and others. In the years following her Tonight Show banishment, Winters occasionally made references to Carson in interviews, usually positive ones that suggested no awareness of his private animosity. This one-sided quality to their feud, with Johnny harboring strong negative feelings that the other party didn't fully comprehend, was a recurring pattern in Carson's professional relationships, speaking to his tendency to smile politely while making mental notes that would affect booking decisions for years to come.
And you wanted to oil up your body and
Well, I didn't want
take
to
your
oil.
clothes off?
No, I didn't want to.
Wasn't that the one?
No, I said, is Arnold going to take off his...
6. Arnold Schwarzenegger, muscles over substance. By the early 1980s, Arnold Schwarzenegger was transitioning from bodybuilding champion to Hollywood action star, riding the success of Conan the Barbarian and beginning to establish himself as a box office draw. For most emerging celebrities, multiple appearances on The Tonight Show would have been a crucial part of this career evolution, a chance to show personality beyond the big screen persona and connect with the American public on a more personal level. But according to those who worked closely with Johnny Carson, Schwarzenegger's early Tonight Show visits left the host decidedly unimpressed and increasingly reluctant to feature the muscle-bound actor on his program. The issues, according to Carson's inner circle, began with Schwarzenegger's first appearance. While the audience responded enthusiastically to the physically imposing Austrian, then a novelty in Hollywood, Johnny reportedly found the interview frustrating on multiple levels. First was the matter of Schwarzenegger's heavily accented English, which sometimes created communication challenges. Carson, known for his quick verbal exchanges and subtle wordplay, found himself having to simplify his questions and speak more slowly than he preferred. More problematic from Johnny's perspective was what he perceived as Schwarzenegger's over-rehearsed responses. According to one Tonight Show writer, Carson complained backstage that every answer sounds memorized, like he's reading lines someone wrote for him, instead of having a real conversation. For a host who prided himself on creating authentic moments of connection and spontaneity, this scripted quality was particularly grating. Then there was the matter of Schwarzenegger's somewhat limited range of topics. His early interviews focused heavily on workout regimens, bodybuilding competitions, and the physical demands of his action roles. For Carson, whose personal interests ran more toward astronomy, animal conservation, and sophisticated humor, these discussions quickly felt repetitive and one-dimensional. Johnny found him arrogant in a way that wasn't entertaining, revealed a former Tonight Show producer. There's a difference between the charming confidence Johnny appreciated in someone like Burt Reynolds and the kind of blunt self-assurance Arnold projected. One invited the audience in on the joke, the other just stated how great he was. After Schwarzenegger's third appearance, Carson allegedly told his booking team, "The muscles impressed the audience, not me." From that point forward, Arnold's Tonight Show invitations became noticeably less frequent, even as his Hollywood star continued to rise. What makes this situation particularly interesting is how it contrasts with the public's growing embrace of Schwarzenegger. While Carson was finding him difficult and unengaging as an interview subject, audiences were flocking to his films in growing numbers. This disconnect highlights the difference between Carson's more sophisticated conversational preferences and the broader public appetite for Schwarzenegger's straightforward, larger-than-life persona. It's worth noting that, unlike some of Carson's other difficult guest relationships, the tension with Schwarzenegger never erupted into open conflict or backstage confrontation. By all accounts, Arnold remained professional and punctual, never creating the kind of behavioral problems that led to more definitive banishments. Johnny's resistance was more subtle, simply featuring him less frequently than his growing celebrity might have warranted. This measured response was typical of Carson's handling of guests he personally disliked, but who remained popular with viewers. Rather than banning them outright, he would space their appearances further apart and perhaps give them shorter segments. It was a strategy that allowed him to maintain the show's broad appeal while still exercising his considerable power over who received the career-boosting exposure his platform provided. For Schwarzenegger, Carson's lukewarm reception ultimately had little impact on his trajectory to becoming one of Hollywood's highest-paid actors, and later, the governor of California. But it does provide a fascinating glimpse into the personal preferences of television's most influential gatekeeper, and a reminder that even future global superstars sometimes failed to impress the man behind the Tonight Show desk. As Schwarzenegger's acting improved, and his English became more fluid in later years, he did occasionally return to The Tonight Show, though never achieving the favorite guest status enjoyed by more verbally dexterous performers. The relationship remained professional but distant, a reminder that in Carson's world, what happened in conversation often mattered more than what happened on the movie screen.
No, I don't feel uncomfortable. I don't know. I never thought about doing one, but I figured if I was going to present myself as a virgin to anyone, it should be you.
7. Madonna, too provocative for the king. When Madonna exploded onto the music scene in the early 1980s, she represented a new kind of pop cultural force, overtly sexual, deliberately provocative, and completely unapologetic about challenging conventional boundaries. Her rapid rise to fame made her an obvious booking choice for The Tonight Show, which prided itself on featuring the biggest names in entertainment. But according to those familiar with Carson's private opinions, Madonna's appearances left him deeply uncomfortable and increasingly unwilling to feature her on his program. The Material Girl's first Tonight Show visit came in 1987 during the height of her Who's That Girl era. By this point, Madonna was already known for pushing boundaries in her music videos, live performances, and public statements. Carson, then in his 60s and raised with decidedly different sensibilities about what constituted appropriate public discourse, found himself unprepared for Madonna's unfiltered approach to conversation. Johnny came from an era where suggestive content was handled with innuendo and double entendre, explained one longtime Tonight Show writer. Madonna's direct, explicit way of discussing sexuality wasn't his style at all. He found it crude rather than clever. The interview proceeded awkwardly from the start, with Madonna making several suggestive comments that visibly flustered Carson. When she playfully flirted with him, a tactic that many female guests employed without incident, Johnny's response was noticeably stiff and uncomfortable rather than engaging with the banter as he typically would. The breaking point came when Madonna made a particularly explicit joke about a sexual encounter. While the audience roared with laughter, cameras caught Carson's genuine reaction before he could compose himself, a flash of what appeared to be actual distaste. Though he quickly recovered his professional demeanor, those who knew him well could see he was genuinely discomfited by the direction of the conversation. Backstage after the segment, Carson was unusually blunt with his producers. "She's not here to talk, she's here to shock," he allegedly complained. "That's not conversation, it's a publicity stunt with legs." According to one staff member, Johnny added, "She might sell records, but she's not selling me." In the years that followed, Madonna's appearances on The Tonight Show became increasingly rare, despite her continuing prominence in music and later film. While other late-night shows featured her regularly, Carson's program maintained a noticeable distance from the controversial star. This reluctance extended beyond Madonna herself to include the broader cultural shift she represented. As popular entertainment became more explicitly sexual and provocative throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Carson increasingly positioned The Tonight Show as a relative oasis of more traditional sensibilities. While never prudish, Johnny's own monologues often included suggestive humor. The show maintained certain boundaries around taste and explicitness that were becoming less common in the broader entertainment landscape. Carson's discomfort with Madonna illuminates a fascinating generational and stylistic divide that was developing in American entertainment. Born in 1925, Johnny had built his career during an era when television operated under much stricter content limitations. His genius lay in navigating these constraints with sophistication, finding ways to be adult and sometimes risque without being explicit. Madonna, born in 1958 to a very different cultural context, represented an approach that viewed such constraints as outdated limitations to be deliberately challenged and broken. Neither approach was inherently superior, but they were fundamentally incompatible in the context of a talk show interview. Carson needed guests willing to play within his conversational framework. Madonna's brand was built on disrupting such frameworks entirely. Their mismatch was less about personal animosity and more about irreconcilable approaches to entertainment. What makes this situation particularly noteworthy is how it reflected broader tensions in American culture during this period. Carson, despite his Vegas performances and adult humor, ultimately represented a certain mainstream traditional sensibility. Madonna deliberately positioned herself in opposition to such traditions. Their uncomfortable encounters on The Tonight Show were microcosms of a larger cultural negotiation happening throughout society, one that continues to this day. For her part, Madonna seemed unfazed by Carson's evident discomfort. If anything, eliciting such reactions aligned perfectly with her self-created image as a provocateur. As she famously said in another context, "I'm not interested in being liked. I'm interested in being heard." She pushed his buttons, and he pulled the plug on future invites.
And I say, look at Johnny Carson. I said, watch how each year he just seems to get more fantastic. And I said, it's a word that...
8. Paul Lynde. Brilliance undermined by chaos. Paul Lynde possessed one of the quickest wits in Hollywood. His sarcastic delivery, impeccable timing, and ability to turn even the most innocent line into a double entendre made him a comedy legend, particularly through his long-running center square position on Hollywood squares. When Lynde appeared on The Tonight Show, audiences were guaranteed moments of genuine hilarity. Yet according to those close to the production, Johnny Carson developed a complex and ultimately negative view of Lynde that had nothing to do with his on-camera performance and everything to do with his behind-the-scenes behavior. Lynde first appeared on The Tonight Show early in Carson's tenure and immediately connected with viewers. His camp humor and barely veiled references to his sexuality, in an era when openly gay entertainers were extremely rare, created memorable moments that producers and audiences alike appreciated. Based solely on the quality of his appearances, Lynde should have become a Carson regular, invited back frequently like other reliable comedy guests. But behind the scenes, a very different story was unfolding. According to multiple sources, Lynde's private behavior created significant problems for The Tonight Show staff. His drinking, which was an open secret in Hollywood, frequently resulted in his arriving at the studio in an unpredictable state, sometimes merely tipsy, other times clearly intoxicated. "You never knew which Paul was going to show up," recalled one former Tonight Show talent coordinator. The brilliant professional comedian or the erratic, difficult drinker. It was like dealing with two completely different people. The unpredictability extended to Lynde's pre-show preparations as well. He was known to make last-minute demands, change agreed-upon topics moments before broadcast, or become disproportionately upset about minor issues like the temperature in the green room or the positioning of his chair. For a show that prided itself on smooth professional operations, these disruptions were deeply problematic. Carson, who maintained a strict separation between his on-air persona and his private vices, had little patience for guests who allowed their personal issues to interfere with the show's production. After one particularly difficult evening, when Lynde had to be practically propped up before going on camera, Johnny allegedly asked his executive producer, "Why do we keep booking that mess?" The producer's answer was simple: because despite the backstage drama, Lynde consistently delivered on camera. His segments reliably generated laughs, which was ultimately the show's primary currency. This created a genuine dilemma for Carson and his team: how to balance the undeniable entertainment value Lynde provided against the chaos he brought to their carefully structured production environment. For several years, they attempted to manage the situation through various accommodations. Lynde would be booked for the first segment of the show, when he was less likely to have been drinking heavily. A staff member would be assigned specifically to manage his needs and keep him on schedule. Clear boundaries were established about arrival times and pre-show preparations. These measures helped but never fully resolved the underlying issues. By the late 1970s, Lynde's appearances had become less frequent, though he was never completely banned. Carson had apparently reached a reluctant conclusion. The brilliant performances weren't worth the backstage disruption. What makes Carson's relationship with Lynde particularly poignant is the evident regret behind his decision. Unlike some guests Johnny simply disliked, Lynde was someone whose talent he genuinely appreciated. According to one writer, Carson once remarked, "Paul makes me laugh harder than almost anyone. I just wish he could pull himself together." This ambivalence was reflected in how Lynde was handled in his final years before his death in 1982. Rather than being definitively blacklisted, he was moved into what staffers called occasional rotation, booked perhaps once a year rather than the multiple annual appearances his comedic abilities might have warranted. Carson's approach to Lynde reveals something important about his priorities as a host and producer. While the viewing audience only saw what happened on camera, Johnny's concerns encompassed the entire production process. Stars who created problems for his staff, disrupted schedules, or brought unprofessional behavior into his workspace found their welcome increasingly limited, regardless of their on-air appeal. As one longtime Carson associate succinctly put it, funny was fine, sloppy wasn't.